When the Andersons moved into their dream home in prestigious Oakwood Heights, they expected some raised eyebrows. What they didn't expect was Eleanor Whitman, their silver-haired neighbor whose relentless harassment seemed to know no bounds. But beneath Eleanor's prejudiced exterior lay a buried truth so explosive it would shake their community to its core. Some secrets they would learn refused to stay buried forever. The Anderson family had been saving for this moment for nearly a decade. Marcus Anderson, a respected cardiothoracic surgeon, and his wife Olivia, a high school principal, had finally found their dream home in the prestigious Oakwood Heights neighborhood. With their two children, 12-year-old Maya and 8-year-old Justin, they were ready to start a new chapter in their lives. The Victorian-style house stood proudly on Maple Drive, its wraparound porch and intricate woodwork catching the morning sun. The moving truck pulled up on a crisp Saturday morning in September, and the family buzzed with excitement as they began unloading their belongings. Maya helped carry smaller boxes, while Justin excitedly explored every corner of their new home. Olivia orchestrated the movers with precision, ensuring furniture went to the right rooms, while Marcus assembled beds and shelving units. Their peaceful moving day was interrupted by the sharp voice of their next-door neighbor, Eleanor Whitman, a woman in her 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer clothing that seemed excessive for a Saturday morning. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone dripping with barely concealed disdain. "I believe you're in the wrong neighborhood. The rental properties are on the other side of town." Marcus straightened up from the box he was carrying, meeting Eleanor's gaze with dignified composure. "Actually, we're the new owners. I'm Dr. Marcus Anderson, and this is my family." Eleanor's lips tightened into a thin line. "There must be some mistake. I'm on the neighborhood association board, and I wasn't informed of any new residents." "No mistake," Olivia said, stepping forward with a warm smile that contradicted the steel in her voice. "We closed on the house last week. We have all the paperwork if you'd like to see it." That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor's harassment became increasingly obvious and creative. She called code enforcement about their moving boxes in the garage, which weren't visible unless she was peering through their windows. She complained about Maya's violin practice, despite the girl only playing during permitted hours. She even reported their meticulously maintained lawn for violations that didn't exist. What Eleanor didn't know was that her actions were catching the attention of other neighbors. Barbara Chen, who lived across the street, started keeping a detailed log of Eleanor's behavior. James and Michael Rodriguez, the gay couple 2 doors down, had security cameras that captured Eleanor's frequent inspections of the Andersons' property line. The Andersons maintained their dignity throughout it all. Marcus continued his work at the prestigious city hospital, saving lives in the operating room. Olivia transformed her struggling high school's academic performance through innovative programs. Maya won first chair in the youth orchestra, and Justin joined the local Little League team, quickly becoming one of their star players. Meanwhile, Eleanor's obsession with the Andersons grew. She began attending every neighborhood association meeting, pushing for stricter enforcement of bylaws that hadn't been updated since the 1950s. She started a neighborhood watch program, which primarily seemed to involve watching the Andersons' house. What she didn't realize was that her grandson Tommy had become fast friends with Justin during Little League practice. The two boys shared a passion for baseball and video games, often playing together at the field while Eleanor was at her weekly bridge club. The situation took an interesting turn when Eleanor's daughter Sarah returned home for a visit. Sarah, a civil rights attorney in Boston, was horrified to discover her mother's behavior. But there was something else, something that made her dig deeper into her family's history. As autumn turned to winter, tension continued to build in Oakwood Heights. Eleanor's complaints became more frequent and less rational. She objected to the Andersons' Christmas decorations, which had won compliments from everyone else, complained about their cars being parked in their own driveway, and even tried to prevent Maya from selling Girl Scout cookies in the neighborhood. But the Andersons weren't alone anymore. Barbara Chen organized a neighborhood potluck where families brought dishes representing their cultural heritage. The Rodriguez couple helped Justin set up a baseball practice area in his backyard. Other neighbors began to openly challenge Eleanor's behavior at community meetings. Then came the day Sarah discovered an old box in Eleanor's attic, filled with yellowed photographs and documents that would shake the foundation of everything Eleanor thought she knew about her family. The story continues to unfold as Eleanor's past collides with her present prejudices, while the Anderson family's grace under pressure begins to transform their community in unexpected ways. The truth Sarah uncovered remains just out of reach, its revelation promising to change everything for both families. Sarah couldn't sleep that night after discovering the box. The documents inside revealed a family secret that made her stomach churn. She spent hours at her laptop, cross-referencing names and dates, her legal training kicking in as she built a case she never expected to make against her own mother. Meanwhile, Eleanor's campaign against the Andersons took an unexpected turn when she slipped on some ice during one of her property inspections and landed in the hospital. To her shock and indignation, the doctor who treated her broken hip was none other than Marcus Anderson. "Dr. Anderson," she said stiffly, unable to meet his eyes as he checked her vitals, "I prefer to be treated by someone else." Marcus maintained his professional demeanor. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm the best orthopedic surgeon on call tonight. Would you rather wait several hours for someone else, risking complications, or let me do my job?" The silence stretched between them until Eleanor finally whispered, "Proceed." The surgery was successful, and Marcus's skilled hands ensured Eleanor would make a full recovery. The incident made the local newspaper, not because of Eleanor's fall, but because Marcus had performed a groundbreaking new minimally invasive procedure that would reduce her recovery time by weeks. The irony wasn't lost on the neighbors. Barbara Chen made sure every resident of Oakwood Heights saw the newspaper article, which featured a photo of Marcus in his surgical scrubs, looking every bit the accomplished professional he was. Tommy, Eleanor's grandson, started visiting his grandmother during her recovery. He'd often bring Justin along, much to Eleanor's discomfort. The boys would play video games in her living room while she watched, confused by their easy friendship and Justin's obvious kindness toward her, despite everything. One afternoon, while Eleanor was napping, Tommy found an old photo album that had fallen from the box Sarah had discovered. He and Justin flipped through it, fascinated by the old black and white photographs. One particular photo caught their attention, a formal portrait of a woman who looked remarkably like Eleanor, standing next to a dark-skinned man in a military uniform. "Who's that?" Justin asked. Tommy shook his head. "I don't know, but look at the date, 1943. They quickly closed the album when they heard Eleanor stirring, but Justin couldn't forget the photograph. He mentioned it to his parents that evening, and Marcus and Olivia exchanged meaningful looks. Sarah, meanwhile, had taken a leave of absence from her law firm. She rented a small office in town and started making phone calls. She contacted historical societies, military archives, and even hired a genealogist. Whatever she'd found in that box had lit a fire under her. The winter began to thaw, and Eleanor's recovery progressed. The Andersons sent her a get-well card signed by the whole family, including a drawing from Justin of her and Tommy playing chess, something they'd started doing during her recovery. The card sat unopened on her mantel for days before curiosity got the better of her. One evening, as Eleanor sat in her favorite chair watching the sunset, she saw Olivia in her garden, teaching Maya how to prune roses. The scene triggered a memory so visceral it made her gasp. Another garden, another mother and daughter from long ago. She gripped her armrest tightly, trying to push the memory away. But the past refused to stay buried. More memories started surfacing, whispered conversations she'd overheard as a child, tears in her mother's eyes when she thought no one was watching, letters that arrived with no return address, and that photograph, the one Tommy and Justin had found, which she'd tried so hard to forget. Sarah's investigation led her to a small town in Georgia, where she spent 3 days interviewing elderly residents. When she returned, she carried a thick manila envelope and dark circles under her eyes. She tried to talk to Eleanor about what she'd found, but Eleanor refused to listen. "The past is the past," Eleanor insisted, her hands shaking as she poured her tea. "Some things are better left alone." But Sarah wouldn't let it go. "Mom, this changes everything. You can't keep pretending." Eleanor cut her off. "I said leave it alone." The tension in Oakwood Heights had shifted. Now it was Eleanor who seemed unsure, vulnerable. She stopped making complaints about the Andersons. Instead, she spent long hours staring at old photographs, jumping whenever the phone rang. The annual neighborhood spring festival was approaching, an event Eleanor had always organized. This year, She quietly declined to participate, citing her recovery. Barbara Chen and Olivia Anderson stepped in to co-chair the committee, and soon the whole neighborhood was buzzing with plans. Then one morning, a registered letter arrived at Eleanor's house. Her hands trembled as she signed for it. The return address was from a law firm in Georgia. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, the unopened letter taunting her. Outside, spring had painted the neighborhood in cheerful colors, but inside her house, shadows seemed to grow longer. The grandfather clock in her hallway ticked away precious minutes as she traced the law firm's embossed letterhead with trembling fingers. Before she could muster the courage to open it, her doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass, she recognized Sarah's silhouette. Her daughter had become a frequent and unwelcome reminder of the past Eleanor desperately wanted to forget. "Mother," Sarah said as she entered, uninvited, "we need to talk about Grandma Rose." Eleanor flinched at the name. "I told you, that subject is off limits." "I found her marriage certificate," Sarah pressed on, "and military records. Everything makes sense now. Why there are no family photos before 1952. Why you grew up in that big house in Connecticut instead of Georgia, where Grandma Rose was born. Why she never talked about her first husband." "Stop it!" Eleanor's teacup clattered against its saucer. "You have no idea what people were like back then, what we had to do to survive." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of laughter from outside. Through the window, they could see Justin teaching Tommy how to throw a curveball in the Andersons' backyard. The boys had become inseparable, their friendship seemingly immune to the adult complications swirling around them. "They remind me of the photograph," Sarah said quietly. "The one of Grandma Rose and—" "Don't," Eleanor whispered, but her protest sounded weak even to her own ears. The registered letter still lay unopened on the table. Sarah's eyes fell on it, recognition flashing across her face. "You got one too?" That evening, the Andersons' home was filled with the aroma of Olivia's famous gumbo. Maya practiced her violin upstairs, while Marcus helped Justin with his math homework. Their peaceful domestic scene was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. Barbara Chen stood on their porch, clutching her tablet. "You need to see this," she said, her voice unusually serious. She pulled up a digitized newspaper article from 1943. The headline read, "Local Debutante Disappears with Soldier." The grainy photograph below the headline showed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor, standing beside a handsome man in military dress uniform. His skin was dark, his smile bright and proud. They stood in front of a small chapel, their happiness radiating through the decades. "There's more," Barbara said, swiping to another article dated 6 months later. "War hero missing in action, young widow returns home." Olivia sat down heavily on the couch. "Eleanor's mother?" Barbara nodded. "Rose Whitman. She returned to her family's estate in Connecticut, where Eleanor was born the following year. The family used their connections to have all records sealed, but Sarah's legal expertise and the recent digitization of military archives changed everything. Meanwhile, in Eleanor's house, the registered letter finally lay open on her desk. Its contents had sent her hurrying to her attic, where she pulled out a small locked box she hadn't opened in decades. Inside was a folded letter, yellow with age, and a tarnished silver locket. The letter began, "My dearest Rose, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back, but know that every moment with you was worth a lifetime." Across the street, Tommy had stayed for dinner with the Andersons. As they finished their gumbo, he innocently mentioned something that made everyone at the table freeze. "Grandma has a picture just like that in her attic," he said, pointing to a framed photograph of Marcus and Olivia on their wedding day. "But it's really old, and the people in it are wearing old-fashioned clothes. The man looks kind of like Dr. Anderson, all dressed up in a soldier uniform." That night, a storm rolled in over Oakwood Heights. Thunder rattled windows as Eleanor sat in her study, surrounded by old photographs and letters. The truth she'd spent a lifetime hiding was finally catching up with her. In her hands, she held the silver locket, its secrets burning like hot coals. The silver locket contained 2 photographs facing each other. On one side was the soldier in his military uniform, his eyes kind and determined. On the other was Rose, young and beautiful, her smile matching his in brightness. When opened, the inscription inside read, "Love knows no bounds. James and Rose, 1943. Eleanor's hands shook as she picked up the letter from the Georgia law firm. The words blurred before her eyes as decades of carefully constructed walls began to crumble. The firm had been hired by someone claiming to be her half-sister, a woman named Pearl Johnson, daughter of James Carter, the soldier who had married Rose Whitman in that small Georgia chapel. The next morning, as Eleanor struggled with her revelation, the spring festival preparations were in full swing. Olivia and Barbara had transformed the neighborhood park into a wonderland of blooming flowers and festive decorations. The entire community was involved, except for Eleanor, who watched from behind her curtains as neighbors carried tables, set up game stations, and strung lights between trees. Sarah arrived unannounced again, this time carrying a large manila envelope and a determined expression. "I found Pearl," she said without preamble. "She's been looking for us for years. She has Dad's, James's, medals from the war. She has letters, photos, everything Grandma Rose managed to save and send to her before." "Before they forced her to come home," Eleanor finished quietly. "Before they made her deny everything and marry Richard Whitman." The truth that Eleanor had buried so deeply was finally emerging. She wasn't Richard Whitman's daughter at all. Her father was James Carter, the brave soldier who had died in World War II, never knowing he had two daughters, Pearl from his first marriage, and Eleanor, his child with Rose. That afternoon, as Eleanor grappled with her reality, Maya Anderson was practicing her violin by the open window. The melody of Amazing Grace floated across the yard, and for the first time, Eleanor didn't reach for the phone to complain. Instead, she found herself crying, remembering how her mother used to hum that very tune while looking at old photographs late at night. Tommy and Justin burst into Eleanor's house after baseball practice, their usual energy filling the quiet spaces. But today, Tommy carried something with him, a school assignment about family heritage. "Grandma," he said excitedly, "can you help me with this? We have to make a family tree, and Mom said you might have some interesting information." Eleanor stared at the blank family tree worksheet, its empty branches seeming to mock her. How could she explain to her grandson that everything he knew about his family history was built on carefully constructed lies? That his great-grandmother had loved a black soldier so deeply she'd defied her entire world to be with him, only to have that love torn away by war and prejudice. As she hesitated, Justin piped up, "We found more pictures in your attic yesterday. There's one with a soldier who looks just like my dad, except in old-timey clothes. Is he our relative?" The innocent question hung in the air like a thundercloud. Eleanor looked at the two boys, one white, one black, sitting together at her kitchen table, their friendship uncomplicated by the prejudices that had shaped her life. In Justin's face, she could suddenly see echoes of the man in the military photograph. The same kind eyes, the same gentle smile. Barbara Chen chose that moment to appear at Eleanor's door, carrying a festival planning folder. But she stopped short when she saw Eleanor's tear-stained face, the scattered photographs, and the boys working on the family tree. "Mrs. Whitman," she said softly, "the Andersons just received a visitor, a woman named Pearl Johnson. She's asking for you." Outside, a car door slammed. Through her window, Eleanor could see an elegant older woman stepping out of a taxi. She moved with a grace that seemed familiar, and when she turned toward Eleanor's house, her smile was the same one that beamed from the photograph in the silver locket. Eleanor's world stopped spinning for a moment as Pearl Johnson made her way up the Andersons' walkway. Marcus and Olivia stood in their doorway, welcoming this stranger who carried pieces of Eleanor's past in her elegant handbag. Tommy and Justin, oblivious to the weight of the moment, continued working on their family tree. Barbara Chen quietly excused herself, but not before giving Eleanor's shoulder a gentle squeeze of support. "I should be there," Eleanor whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But her feet felt rooted to the floor. Decades of carefully maintained prejudices warring with the truth that could no longer be denied. Sarah appeared at her mother's side. "Come on, Mom, it's time." The walk across the lawn felt like crossing an ocean. Eleanor noticed details with strange clarity. The dandelions Justin had missed while mowing yesterday. The wind chimes Maya had hung from the Andersons' porch. The afternoon sun casting long shadows across perfectly manicured grass. Pearl Johnson stood as Eleanor approached. She was wearing a blue dress that brought out the warmth in her dark skin, and around her neck hung a silver locket identical to Eleanor's. The two women stared at each other, searching for traces of James Carter in each other's faces. "Hello, little sister," Pearl said softly. Inside the Andersons' living room, Pearl opened her handbag and began laying out pieces of a shared history. James Carter's Purple Heart and Distinguished Service Cross, letters he'd written from the front lines, photographs of him with both Rose and his first wife, Pearl's mother. "Daddy wrote to Rose until the end," Pearl explained, her voice gentle. "He knew about you, Eleanor. He knew Rose was carrying his child when he shipped out for his last mission. He was so happy, so proud. He wrote that love had given him 2 beautiful daughters, and that was worth fighting for." Eleanor's hands trembled as she picked up her father's medals. Mother never spoke of him. After she married Richard Whitman, it was as if that part of her life never existed. She taught me to hide everything that might reveal the truth. "Is that why you've been so cruel to my family?" Marcus asked quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since Eleanor entered their home. His question held no accusation, only a deep sadness. Before Eleanor could respond, Tommy's voice rang out from the doorway. "Grandma, Justin and I finished the family tree, but there's something weird. How come Great-Grandpa Richard's dates don't match up with when you were born?" The room fell silent. Justin stood beside his friend, holding the family tree worksheet. Both boys looked confused as they glanced between the adults. Pearl was the first to move. She walked over to the boys and knelt between them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Would you like to hear a story about a brave soldier named James Carter, who loved so deeply that he changed 2 families forever?" As Pearl began to speak, Eleanor sank into the Andersons' comfortable armchair. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. The spring festival decorations swayed in the evening breeze, and somewhere down the street, a child's laughter floated on the air. Sarah sat on the arm of her mother's chair, her hand finding Eleanor's. Together, they listened as Pearl wove together the threads of their shared history, a history that had come full circle in ways none of them could have imagined. Maya appeared in the doorway with her violin, drawn by the gathering in the living room. As Pearl spoke of James and Rose's love story, Maya began to play softly, not Amazing Grace this time, but a gentle melody that seemed to capture all the joy and pain, love and loss of their family's journey. The truth was unfolding in the Andersons' living room, but the story wasn't over yet. Pearl had one more envelope in her bag, one more piece of the puzzle that would change everything. The envelope Pearl withdrew from her bag was weathered and thick with age. Its seal had been broken decades ago, but the contents remained preserved with extraordinary care. Inside were property deeds, old bank statements, and a will that had never been executed. "James Carter didn't just leave us his love," Pearl explained, spreading the documents on the Andersons' coffee table. "He left a legacy that was hidden from both of us." The papers revealed that James had purchased several properties before his final deployment, including a significant plot of land in what was now the most valuable part of town. One property in particular made Eleanor's breath catch. 1242 Maple Drive, the very house she now lived in. "That's impossible," Eleanor whispered. "Our father bought this land when it was nothing but open fields," Pearl continued. "He dreamed of building a community where his children could grow up together, where love would matter more than color. But after he died..." "Mother's family buried everything," Sarah finished, her legal mind quickly piecing together the implications. "They used their influence to hide the purchases, to make it look like the Whitmans had always owned the property." Justin, who had been listening intently, suddenly perked up. "Does this mean Eleanor's house actually belongs to all of you?" Marcus and Olivia exchanged glances, the weight of this revelation hanging heavy in the room. Their own house, just next door, sat on land that had also once belonged to James Carter. Tommy looked up from the documents with wide eyes. "So Justin and I, we're kind of like family?" Pearl smiled softly. "We always were, honey. Some people just worked very hard to make us forget that." Eleanor sat perfectly still, her world tilting on its axis. Every nasty comment she'd made, every complaint she'd filed, every suspicious glance she'd cast at the Andersons. It all came back to her now, tasting like ashes in her mouth. She'd spent her life perpetuating the very prejudices that had torn her own family apart. Barbara Chen, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward. "The spring festival is tomorrow," she said. "Maybe it's time we turned it into something more, a celebration of truth, reconciliation, and family." Maya, who had been playing her violin softly throughout the conversation, transitioned into a new melody. The notes seemed to weave together the past and present, creating a bridge between what was lost and what could still be found. As the music filled the room, Pearl reached into her bag one final time. "There's something else," she said, pulling out a smaller envelope. Something James Carter wrote the day before his last mission. He asked that it be opened only when his daughters were together. The envelope remained sealed, its contents still unknown after all these years. Eleanor and Pearl looked at each other, their father's last words waiting to be discovered. But Pearl didn't open it immediately. Instead, she placed it on the table between them. "Tomorrow," she said, "at the festival. It's time everyone knew the true history of Oakwood Heights." That night, Eleanor lay awake in her bed, listening to the distant sound of festival preparations. Workers were setting up lights and stages in the park, unaware that tomorrow's celebration would become something far more significant than anyone had planned. In the Anderson household, Marcus and Olivia stayed up late, discussing the implications of the day's revelations. Maya composed a new piece on her violin, trying to capture the emotion of the moment, while Justin added a new branch to his own family tree. And somewhere in between these two houses, the ghost of James Carter's dream lived on. A dream of a community united by love, rather than divided by fear. As the night deepened, the sealed envelope sat in Pearl's guest room, waiting to share its secrets with a neighborhood on the brink of transformation. The morning of the spring festival dawned bright and clear. The neighborhood stirred early, with volunteers bustling about, setting up the final decorations. The park had been transformed into a wonderland of spring flowers, colorful banners, and twinkling lights that would shine as day turned to evening. Eleanor stood before her mirror, holding up two different dresses. For the first time in years, she cared about how she would be perceived, not out of pride, but out of a desire for reconciliation. She finally chose a simple blue dress, the same shade as the one Pearl had worn yesterday. The festival was set to begin at noon, but by 11, families were already gathering. The Rodriguez couple had set up a face painting station, and Barbara Chen was organizing the potluck tables. The air was filled with the mingled aromas of dishes from dozens of different cultures. Maya Anderson had been given a special spot on the small stage, where she would perform the piece she'd composed overnight. She'd titled it James and Rose, though only a handful of people understood the significance of the name. Sarah arrived early carrying boxes of hastily printed photographs and documents. With Barbara's help, she began setting up a display on one of the community boards. Soon, the story of James Carter and Rose Whitman emerged in black and white photographs, newspaper clippings, and letters. A visual timeline of love defying the odds. Tommy and Justin ran from station to station, their excitement infectious. They'd convinced their friends to help them create a special presentation of their own, though they kept the details secret from the adults. Their whispered conversations and barely contained grins suggested something significant in the works. As people began to fill the park, Pearl Johnson made her entrance. She carried herself with quiet dignity, greeting everyone she met with genuine warmth. Those who didn't know her story were drawn to her natural grace, while those who did watched in anticipation of what was to come. The Andersons moved through the crowd as well, Olivia's hand tucked into Marcus's arm. If anyone noticed that Eleanor Whitman wasn't making her usual complaints about noise levels or permit violations, they didn't mention it. At precisely noon, Barbara Chen stepped onto the small stage to officially open the festival. But before she could speak, Tommy and Justin rushed up, asking for permission to start things differently this year. Barbara, seeing Pearl's encouraging nod, handed them the microphone. The boys had prepared a presentation about family trees, inspired by their school assignment. But instead of focusing on their individual families, they'd created an intricate web showing how many of the neighborhood's families were connected, through marriage, through friendship, through shared history. At the center of their display was a photograph of James Carter in his military uniform, standing proud and tall. Next to it, they'd placed a current photograph of the two of them, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. "This is our great-grandfather," Tommy announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. "He fought for our country, and he fought for love." Justin took the microphone next. "And we found out yesterday that because of him, we're not just best friends, we're family." A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor, standing at the back, felt tears running down her cheeks. Pearl made her way to stand beside her, their shoulders touching lightly. Maya began to play, her violin singing out the story of James and Rose, of love lost and found again, of truth buried and finally unearthed. As the music swelled, Pearl reached into her purse and withdrew the sealed envelope, James Carter's last words to his daughters. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as Pearl and Eleanor moved toward the stage. Decades of separation, of prejudice, of fear and denial had led to this moment. Pearl's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, unfolding the yellowed paper within. Eleanor gripped the edge of the stage for support as Pearl began to read their father's final message, his words reaching across time to heal the wounds of the past and shape the future of Oakwood Heights. "My dearest daughters," Pearl read, her voice strong and clear in the hushed park. "If you're reading this, it means you've finally found each other, and with that discovery, found the truth that others tried so hard to bury." James Carter's letter was both a love letter and a vision for the future. He wrote of his dreams for the land he'd purchased, not just as property to pass down, but as the foundation for a community where his children and grandchildren could live without the burden of prejudice. He spoke of Rose's courage in defying her family, and of his hope that their love would someday help bridge the divisions that plague society. "Remember," the letter concluded, "that the greatest legacy we leave isn't in property or possessions, but in the courage to love freely and the wisdom to learn from our mistakes. Pearl, my firstborn, and Eleanor, my final gift. You are living proof that love knows no boundaries. Together, you can build the world I dreamed of, but didn't live to see." As Pearl folded the letter, Eleanor stepped forward, facing the crowd of neighbors she'd spent years trying to keep at arm's length. Her voice shook as she began to speak. "I've lived my entire life running from who I am," she said. "I became the very thing my parents fought against, and in doing so, I nearly destroyed the dream they died protecting." She turned to the Andersons. "I owe you more apologies than I can ever make, but I hope you'll let me try." Marcus stepped forward, taking Eleanor's trembling hands in his. "Your father's dream isn't dead, Mrs. Whitman. Look around. It's alive right here, right now." The property deeds were formally transferred that afternoon, with Sarah handling the legal details. The land was placed in a trust, jointly managed by both families, dedicated to maintaining the neighborhood as an inclusive community for generations to come. Tommy and Justin's family tree project earned them an A+ in school, but more importantly, it became the centerpiece of a new tradition in Oakwood Heights. Each year, during the Spring Festival, new branches were added as more connections were discovered and created among the residents. Eleanor sold her large house, moving into a smaller cottage on the property, and donated the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in James Carter's name. The fund helped families who might otherwise be priced out of the neighborhood achieve their dreams of home ownership. Maya's composition, James and Rose, became the official song of Oakwood Heights, played at every community gathering. She went on to study music at Juilliard, but always returned home for the Spring Festival to perform it. Pearl became a frequent visitor, her presence a reminder of the power of truth and reconciliation. She and Eleanor made up for lost time, sharing stories of their separate lives and discovering the many ways their father's spirit had lived on in both of them. As for the Andersons, they thrived in their home. Their initial struggles transformed into a testimony of resilience and grace. Marcus's hospital named him chief of surgery, while Olivia's innovative education programs were adopted district-wide. One evening, a year after the revelations at the Spring Festival, Eleanor sat on her cottage porch with Pearl, watching Tommy and Justin play catch in the golden light of sunset. Barbara Chen walked by with a plate of cookies, and the Rodriguez couple waved from their garden. "Do you think he knew?" Eleanor asked softly. "Did Father know it would all work out this way?" Pearl smiled, touching the silver locket she still wore. "He knew love would find a way," she said. "It always does." The sun sank lower, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. In the distance, Maya's violin could be heard practicing for her upcoming recital. The sound floated across the neighborhood that James Carter had dreamed of, where love had finally triumphed over fear, and truth had set them all free. In the end, it wasn't karma that hit Eleanor Whitman. It was love, the same love that had brought James Carter and Rose Whitman together. the same love that had given them 2 daughters, and the same love that now flowed through the streets of Oakwood Heights, binding together a community that had learned the greatest truth of all. Family is not defined by blood or color, but by the capacity of the heart to grow large enough to embrace us all.